You are listening to the HP Outdoors Waterfowl Podcast, episode 24. This week on the HP Outdoors Waterfowl Podcast, we're going to be joined by Delta Waterfowl Vice President of U.S. Policy, John Devney, and we're going to profile the Common Goldeneye. All right, welcome everybody to the episode 24 of the HP Outdoors Waterfowl Podcast. We are your on-demand audio source for all things waterfowl and waterfowl hunting. You can find us at www.hpoutdoors.com as well as on iTunes. Joining me on this week's episode, as he always tends to do, is my co-host Dan Harushka. Dan, what's up, buddy?
Oh, we're just getting through this frost up here. I know I talk about the weather a lot or just random headache comments, but yeah, we're sitting about -5 degrees, so it's one of those nights that I brought the podcast in my house instead of sitting in the attic of my garage.
That's great. Yeah, we laugh about this a lot together, and a little inside baseball for our listeners here. You would laugh if you saw the conditions that Dan and I podcast in. Half the time he's in his garage, whether it be back in the, summer when we started, it's 100 degrees out there, and back, into the wintertime when he's layering up in his gear and his Carhartt bibs to go out and podcast. And I'm literally sitting in my son's playroom surrounded by little, trampolines and Home Depot drills that he plays with and books and all this other stuff. But it's the only quiet place in the house, so it tends to work out just fine. Yeah. But we encourage you, though, to keep up with us when we're not podcasting and you're not listening to the show. We can track us down on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We've recently started the Instagram profile, so we're trying to stay active in there. And for you Facebook users out there, we have a closed group that's exclusively for the listeners of this podcast. If you go on there and search the HP Outdoors Waterfowl Podcast listeners group, you can request access to join us in there, and we'll more than happy to let you in. And we got a great group in there right now, and a lot of great discussion on just different topics and gear and strategies and things. So we're really happy with how that group has been turning out. And if you'd like to join in the conversation, head on over there and join us. You can also call the show at our HP Outdoors hotline at 724-609-FOWL. At 724-609-3695. If you have a question or comment or concern, you can leave us a voicemail. And if it's a really good one, we'll play it on the air for everybody to hear and, use that for discussion. And if it's not, we'll just not do anything with it. A couple things I wanted to address here this week before we get into the main part of the show. I've been getting a lot of questions about the barrel stickers that guys are seeing in our videos and our pictures and stuff like that. We are actively trying to get more of those made, and we should have those available through our website here in the very near future, hopefully, fingers crossed. So hang tight with us there. Those are coming out. And then, we have our waterfowl listener survey that you can fill out on our website, and we have it on our Facebook page and stuff. And it's your opportunity to give us some feedback. And some of the feedback that we get a lot that I see is, don't quit, keep doing it. We enjoy it, that sort of thing. See a lot of podcasts kind of burn out and fade out and that sort of thing. I don't know where you stand on this, Dan, but pretty much how I feel about it is we're trying to do a weekly show so that everyone can kind of stay engaged and, that sort of stuff. It is a lot of work. I can tell you that right now. So I can see how guys get burnt out and that kind of thing. But what keeps it motivating for me is hearing the feedback from the listeners and engaging with them in discussions about hunting and various things, and just knowing that there's other people out, that there's people out there enjoying the content and, sharing the same passion that we do. So as long as that keeps coming, for me, it's totally worth it. And, I plan on to continue doing it on a weekly basis for the foreseeable future. So, I don't know where you stand on that, Dan, but I wanted to put that out there because I know we get a lot of people making comments about that, through our listener survey.
Yeah, and I try and say that quite often. We appreciate the calls, we appreciate the emails, and I really enjoy the listeners group and all the chatting that we do in there. So it's a good time, and like you said, it keeps us engaged, and the seasons are coming to an end. So it's something we think about all the time, but, sometimes it is, like you said, it is a lot of work. You have your son there, and I got twins and another one on the way, which is nuts. So, I mean, it's going to be even more work, but, getting those emails and everything, it makes it worth it. And knowing that, we made one hunt better is worth it to me. We get emails all the time saying, you guys helped me, and, these are my first kills this year. And I mean, it's great to be a part of that. So, that's kind of what we set out to do. And it just feels good to get the feedback like you mentioned.
Yeah. And regardless of if we're helping people or not helping, if you're more experienced or what have you, there's a gap out there as far as on-demand audio pertaining to waterfowl and waterfowl hunting. So, we're trying to fill that gap the best we can. So as long as you guys are still enjoying it and providing us feedback, we're going to keep, grinding it out and moving forward with the show. One thing I wanted to also touch on is, you've probably noticed lately, we've had a lot of things going on here as far as, partnerships that we're developing and just relationships that we're developing with, industry partners in various capacities. Recently we joined up with Sportier, and, we've got our other, companies that we've partnered with. And, the thing that goes along with these is one, there has to be a set of criteria for each partner that, we use with this show. And the criteria is it has to be a product that we believe in and that we use. It has to be a product that we believe our listeners can benefit from as well. It wouldn't do us any good to partner up with a company that produces, I don't know, basket weaving kits or whatever the heck it is. We're partnering with companies that provide a great product that we believe in and trust, and that we believe you all as listeners need to know about and can be useful for you in the field. So we're not just trying to partner with companies to boost our egos or anything like that. It's legitimately, we want to share great products with the people that listen to this show. And then the final thing is too, we want to use our partnerships with these companies to help spread the word about the podcast and just reach more people and grow the audience base. Because by growing the audience base, it's going to increase interaction between the listeners and us and feed ideas for content for the show. And then thus is going to benefit everybody. So it's all about spreading waterfowl related information, getting good quality content out there, and just raising the profile to try to reach as many waterfowl hunters that are interested in this type of stuff as we can. So you see all that stuff going on. And a really exciting thing that we've had recently with our partnership with Bison Coolers, maker of the Brute Box, they've actually offered a discount code through HP Outdoors for all of our listeners. So if you're interested in a Bison cooler, you can head on over to their website. And if you use the discount code HP Outdoors, you can get $15 off any hard side cooler. So, they're a top end 5-day cooler. They're no joke, Dan. We both have one. We love them. They're fantastic. If you're in the market for that type of cooler and you're looking to save a little coin on it, use the HP Outdoors discount, and definitely at least consider them if you're looking for that line of cooler.
Yeah, I actually have two of the coolers, and I think you do, yeah. I think it was a little unfair of you to say that basket weaving would be something that we're not interested in.
I mean, I'm not going to let you speak for me, Dan. So,
all right, let's go.
Everyone can tune in to listen to the Dan Harushka basket weaving podcast coming to you soon. So, till then, I'll stay over here talking waterfowl hunting. But all kidding aside, this episode that we have this week is fantastic. We've got John Devney from Delta Waterfowl this week, and there was just so much information that we wanted to cover with him. He's such a wealth of information and knowledge that it's actually going to be a 2-part interview. So next week we're going to have the second half of the interview, but the first week, the first half this week is going to talk a little bit more about Delta Waterfowl policies, how they fight for hunters' rights and access opportunities and legislation and things of that nature. And then next week, we're going to get into some habitat management and what you can do on your properties and that kind of stuff. So 2 weeks we're going to have with Mr. Devney, just because we covered so much great information with him. And, I think it's definitely something that everyone here is going to enjoy. this week we've made a selection for the duck profile. It's a good one in my opinion because it's a duck that's sort of an elusive one for me. And you probably get a few more of these up your way than we do down here. But the Common Goldeneye is it's sort of a trophy duck in my opinion, just because we don't get that many of them. And when we do get them, it's usually late and it's cold and all that kind of stuff. So makes for a good story. Usually, you have to put in your work to get them. And, I'm looking forward to doing that profile. So why don't we go ahead and get into it, Dan?
Well, can I ask you a question real quick?
Is it like how to produce your Basket Weaving podcast? Because we can handle that later. Okay, no, go ahead.
Is the Goldeneye one that is pretty much to themselves if you're setting up any kind of long lines? Is that right? Are they keep to themselves?
Yeah, they're similar, in the same vein as like a bufflehead. They tend to kind of stick in with their own species. Yeah. Okay,
just a little side part. I thought you mentioned that, and I don't ever set up for them, so just wanted to check.
Yeah. I know they get into them up there in Lake Erie a good bit. So something you might want to kick the tires on here in the future. But maybe you'll rethink your Goldeneye strategy here after we go ahead and profile them right now.
All right, the male comes in at 19 inches and the female at 17, and a pretty good weight differential. The male's at 2.3 pounds and the female's at 1.7. And the Common Goldeneye, obviously, it's named for the brilliant yellow iris. And Common Goldeneyes also fly in small, compact clusters, and their wings make a very distinctive whistle at every beat. The male Goldeneye, they have a blackish iridescent green head with a white circular patch between the eye and the base of the bill. It's it sticks out a lot, so it's something that is easy to tell them apart from. The breast, sides, belly, and patch across the secondaries and the secondary wing coverts are white. The back, rump, and upper tail coverts are black, and the tail is grayish-brown. And the bill is black, and the legs and feet are sort of yellow. The female Common Goldeneye, which I actually, driving around on my lunch break today, was watching at a Conneaut Lake. It was around some of the boat launches there, and she was by herself. There wasn't a male, but anyway. Female Common Goldeneyes, they have a chocolate brown head, a whitish neck band, and a speckled gray back and sides. And the upper wings are brownish black with the middle 5 secondaries colored white. And the bill is blackish, becoming yellow near the tip, which another thing I learned today is that sometimes the bills are completely black, and the legs and feet are yellowish. When it comes to breeding, Common Goldeneyes breed across forested areas of Canada, Minnesota, Michigan, Alaska, and the northeastern U.S. They are most abundant among the lakes of the Canadian boreal forest, especially where lakes and deep marshes have substantial invertebrate populations. And they are cavity nesters and have a strong homing tendency. And the female Common Goldeneye lays an average of 9 eggs. And they'll nest in tree cavities, usually abandoned by woodpeckers. Imagine that.
Very resourceful of them to do so. As far as their migration and their wintering patterns, some of them will move from the interior to the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts and south along the Mississippi and Snake Rivers. Along the Atlantic coast, birds will winter from Newfoundland to Florida. Along the Pacific coast, will go down as far south as California. The St. Lawrence River, Great Lakes, we've mentioned Lake Erie, also provide really good wintering habits for the Common Goldeneye. Populations, as far as recent breeding surveys, the data that I have here is dated. It's from the 70s, which had the population at about 1.25 million birds. I'm pretty confident that it's higher than that these days. I don't know the exact numbers, but everything that I was able to obtain basically stated that the populations appear to be pretty stable. The wintering populations of the Common Goldeneye along the Chesapeake Bay and in Maryland, close to us and sort of where we like to hunt, they've been decreasing, unfortunately, steadily since the 1980s due to deteriorating habitat. As far as their food habitats, the Common Goldeneye use brackish and saltwater bays and, deep freshwater habitats in the winter to dive and feed on a variety of available animal life. In inland areas, during the summer and the fall, they feed on aquatic insects, crustaceans, and aquatic plants. Along the coastal wintering grounds, they will feed largely on crustaceans, mollusks, and small fish and some plant material. So if you don't have an opportunity to hunt them very often, it's kind of unfortunate because they're a cool bird. I wish I had more opportunity to hunt them more, but there you go. Common Goldeneye. Dan, you mentioned how they you asked me about how they decoy and stuff to themselves. And, I haven't hunted them enough to know, but I have a suspicion that, if you were to set up a group of buffleheads or something similar to that on the side, I would have to imagine that they would at least come close enough to get a good look at them, which if you set your decoys right would be within gun range. So I don't know if you have to go out and buy a group of Goldeneye decoys or not, but, I'm not the authority on it, but I got to imagine that they'd work a spread at least to some degree, wouldn't you?
I would think so. I would imagine.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the Goldeneye, Common Goldeneye, cool little bird, and definitely a lot more information out there about them. If you want to check them out, you can hit up, DU's website or something like that. They got lots of information there. So, we talked about this a little bit ago. We kind of prefaced it, but we're getting ready to do an interview here with John Devney of Delta Waterfowl, the Vice President of U.S. Policy, and he's been with Delta Waterfowl for 16 years. Been through, seen a lot of different legislations to go through and all of that kind of stuff. And we hope to get into it with him, but I want to just sort of point out to everybody the differences between Delta Waterfowl and some of the other organizations out there. Delta Waterfowl is one of the few that really advocate on the behalf of hunters. And so not only are they focused on conservation and habitat management, but they're also equally focused on hunters' opportunities, Sunday hunting, legislation that promotes hunter accessibility and things of that nature. So it's really nice to have a voice at the table on behalf of the hunters out there, just like you and me. So I'm very partial to Delta Waterfowl in that regard. I'm a member, and we don't have a local chapter here, unfortunately, but I do contribute to them annually and maintain a membership with them, because that's the number one membership benefit that they can offer me. They've got a voice at the table and they're advocating on behalf of me. So I don't know if every other organization does that, but I know that Delta's doing that. So they're a prime organization in my opinion.
And one of the great things I would think that people would imagine when we reach out to companies and want them to promote themselves, like, you think that a lot of them would get back in a hurry, and a lot of them do not. And maybe we're just not reaching that many people yet, or I don't know what the deal is, but sometimes it's very difficult to get guests. John was on the phone within, I don't even know, maybe 30 minutes from the time I sent the email. They want to get their voice out. They want to be heard, and they have a lot of great information, and they do a lot for the hunters, like you were saying. So it's definitely, if you're not a member, look into it, and I'm excited to talk to them.
Yep. I don't even want to waste any more time because it's a pretty lengthy interview. Like we mentioned, it's going to be a 2-part series here on the show. So we'll get into the first part here right now, and we're going to be joined by Vice President of U.S. Policy, Delta Waterfowl, John Devney. All right, we'd like to welcome a guest to our show who has a lot of great knowledge about a lot of topics that the listeners to our show want to know about. So we're really excited to have him on today. And joining us from Delta Waterfowl is their Vice President of U.S. Policy, John Devney. John, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys.
No, it's our privilege to have you on the show. We're really excited to talk to you about some of the things that Delta Waterfowl has been involved with, and just the impact that you guys have on the waterfowl landscape and habitat and advocating for hunters' opportunities and legislation and things of that along those lines. So we're really excited to get into some of those topics with you. But before we do that, maybe maybe you can just sort of give us a general brief overview of, Delta Waterfowl and sort of the mission that you guys have there.
Yeah, I think, I think there's a lot of duck hunters that, just because they've only very recently heard of Delta, could kind of come to the conclusion Delta is a relatively new organization. And I think in terms of general awareness amongst duck hunters, we really are. But the organization's been around, guys, for a long time. We trace our roots all the way back to 1911. The organization really got its footing in the late 1930s and 1938 under the counsel and tutelage, believe it or not, Aldo Leopold, who started the Waterfowl research program at Delta in 1938. And, for the vast majority of Delta's history, really from the late 30s into the late 1990s, Delta existed as a, fairly quiet waterfowl research facility, supporting really important, I don't mean to say quiet in the fact that it wasn't important. Much of what the research at Delta did in the 30s, 40s, and through the 90s was sort of foundational to our understanding of North American ducks, geese, and their habitat. But it wasn't real well known amongst duck hunters. It was certainly renowned amongst waterfowl professionals, state agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Delta graduate students have long populated the ranks of the leadership of, Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state agencies, organizations like Ducks Unlimited, and other nonprofits. But, the organization just wasn't real known, frankly, to our most important customer, which is the duck hunter. And guys, that really started to change, I think, in the late 1990s when I think Delta recognized that it couldn't achieve its entire sort of mission and vision for the world solely doing scientific research. And, we were doing research on predator management, hen houses, and tools that showed great promise, but really no enthusiasm within the waterfowl management community to pick those up. And we also started looking at how duck hunting was declining and, the implication that has on this, the tradition we all cherish and love. And so Delta's sort of evolved with the times. And just recently, just this past September, our board of directors just ratified our new strategic plan that I think is the boldest one in the 16 years that I've been at Delta, and really charting a course. And our organization today is built really around the needs of duck hunters to make sure duck production is occurring through tools like predator management, hen houses, looking for sort of visionary public policy solutions to conserve habitat on the duck side. And then on the hunting side, there's no reason for us to exist if there's not duck hunting. And we're happy to have the largest hunter recruitment program in North America. And we're fighting every day to represent duck hunters, both the U.S. and Canada. So the organization today is built to serve the needs of duck hunters. And as such, we refer to ourselves as a duck hunters organization.
Yeah, and Delta definitely has a very rich history, as you touched on a few points there. And, you guys are behind the hunters. So let's talk about the hunters a little bit. Talk about, the hunter numbers and the popularity of actual waterfowl hunting. And, talk about any youth programs available through Delta. And on top of that, if you could speak to the money that is generated from hunters, if you would.
Yeah, I think the first sort of dose of reality we had was in the year 2000, and I remember a colleague of mine, Jim Fisher, who works in our Canadian office, calling down, and he was sort of perusing the annual waterfowl harvest statistics, and he was looking at hunter numbers, and he was looking at the comparison with the Canadian hunter numbers in 2000 to where it was in the 70s. And believe it or not, guys, at that point, duck hunting had collapsed. We lost 70% of the waterfowl hunters in the country of Canada. And he said, well, what the heck's happening in the States? Well, we looked at what was happening in the States. You remember, the late 90s were a time with abundant ducks, liberal seasons. There were good times for duck hunting. And duck hunter numbers had certainly bounced back from where they were in the late 80s and early 90s, but we were still a third below where we were in those periods. And really, in the last 15 years, there's been some ups and downs, but the trend is generally declining with waterfowl hunting in the United States. And there's some problems with the statistics, for the last bunch of statistics we got out from the Fish and Wildlife Service. But I think it's pretty clear to everybody that waterfowl hunting participation is declining. That's a real concern. I mean, everybody's talked about, that you guys are in the Atlantic Flyway. Obviously, you've heard and read, volumes about the decline in black ducks. There's, all these action plans to save the black duck. There's been lots of discussion about lesser scaup or species like canvasback. I was concerned over widgeon for a few years, when in reality, there isn't a single duck species that's in worse shape than duck hunters are in North America relative to where they were in the 70s. And what was fascinating to us is we hear a lot of talk about black ducks. We heard nobody talking about duck hunting. And at that point, Delta Waterfowl amended our mission to say, listen, if duck hunting isn't sound and if, there aren't people out enjoying this resource, there's really no reason for us to be here. And not only is it, not only are duck hunters the most important conservationists, not only do duck hunters put, millions and billions of dollars back into the resource they care so deeply about, this is a tradition that's worth fighting for. And so Delta's been oriented around that since we amended our mission in 2001, and our programming has really reflected that ever since.
And speak to, I know Delta has some youth programs. Could you go into those a little bit?
Yeah, really the catalyst for that, guys, was that sort of discovery. And in 2001, we petitioned the Canadian government to create a youth waterfowl season, much like the seasons that the Fish and Wildlife Service has authorized here in the U.S. And believe it or not, we found ourselves on the front page of the Canadian, the largest Canadian newspaper, with a headline that says Ottawa and hunting groups wanting to arm children. And not exactly the pretty odd headline. But it turns out we battled back against some sort of anti-hunting and anti-gun interest and got that first youth season. And we held the first ever youth hunt in Canada. And that experience really kind of taught us a model, or it was a pilot effort that we've now extended all across the country. I mean, I just saw the statistics for where we anticipate coming in for our current fiscal year, and we're going to recruit almost 10,000 kids to hunting and shooting in the outdoors through our first hunt program this year. And I think the thing that Delta realized is that being an organization with an office in Bismarck, North Dakota, and Winnipeg, we're not in a position to put on youth hunts all over the country ourselves and with our staff. We've got a very modest staff complement. In the U.S. and Canada, we only have 40 employees. But really, that program, our first hunt program, is delivered by our local chapters and volunteers that have the passion and enthusiasm and the relationship with, both boys and girls and young adults and even adults in their communities that are interested in hunting. And the other really wonderful thing about that is, our chapter system is set up where those chapters can invest 25% of their net proceeds from their local fundraising events right back into youth hunts in their community. It's a really wonderful partnership that I think sort of is expressed through Delta's vision and the way we want to do hunter recruitment, but really capitalizes on the passion, enthusiasm, and dedication of our volunteers and local communities to get the real hard work done.
And that's 10,000 kids on a first youth hunt is a pretty great number, I would say. Let's talk about, so 2014, the hunter numbers are going down, but the duck populations seem to be going up. Has waterfowl opportunities, have they ever been better? And now that, you're talking about hunting numbers going down and it just seems like the duck numbers are going up, is there a correlation there or what do you think?
Not really. I mean, Duck populations, the sort of story or the sort of term I've always used for it is, the duck populations we had from the mid 1990s, starting in 1994 and then running through the year about 2000. Those duck numbers were given to us by God and Congress. And what I mean by God and Congress is, we had very favorable water conditions, especially in the U.S. portions of the prairie pothole region. And we had the Conservation Reserve Program, which put a tremendous amount of nesting cover on the landscape. And that frankly drove duck populations and duck production to unheard of numbers or unheard of levels in the 90s to 2007. Now, from 2007, I think if Congress is much credit, I'm going to give it all to God. And why I say that is that, the Conservation Reserve Program, based on the federal deficit and a number of other issues, has really retreated. We've lost 2 million acres of CRP nesting cover in North Dakota alone since 2007. So really what's driven duck populations from 2007 to where we are today, guys, it's all about God. We've been very, very, very lucky to have really favorable water conditions. And I could spend hours boring you and your audience about the intricacies of breeding duck biology, and maybe we'll find a time to bore you to tears with that. But the fact of the matter is, given the right environmental conditions, ducks will reproduce like bacteria. And that's really what's happened here over the last several years.
It's exciting to see the duck, surveys come out and be as strong as they are. And we do a duck profile on our show every week where we pick a duck species and we talk about that. And, the majority of them, if not almost all of them that we've covered, they're all above their long-term averages, and year over year, they're going in the positive direction, which is, all great. And obviously conserving habitat and doing the things that, help that to flourish is important. But I want to ask you a little bit about something that I feel, is a little bit more specific to Delta's mission, like you've touched on. And, when you get on the website and you read about, your membership opportunities and the benefits of a membership, and you do a publication that you put out and this, that, and the other, one of the biggest things that I feel as a Delta Waterfowl member, one of the biggest benefits of my subscription and membership is the fact that there's a voice at the table for me as a duck hunter, someone in the fight lobbying and positioning on the behalf of the hunter. So talk a little bit about how Delta Waterfowl gets involved in legislation, as far as, policy and those sorts of things, for hunter and hunter access. I mean, for example, Virginia just got Sunday hunting. This was the first year that we've had it, so I know that there's only a handful of states left that don't have it. Pennsylvania, where Dan's at, being one of them. But talk a little bit about how Delta Waterfowl, gets involved in policy and influencing legislation and things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll tell you a funny anecdote. I was in Louisiana 2 springs ago, and I was in front of all of our volunteer leadership from Texas or Southeast Texas and all of Louisiana. And we were talking about Delta's programs, and we talked about habitat conditions on the prairies, how good things looked. And I said, okay, guys, I said, serious topic now. I said, how many of you guys want to talk about politics and legislation? And every single guy in the room looked straight at the floor. And what I said was, I said, folks, this may be a really hard reality. Duck hunters typically don't want to spend a lot of time talking about politics. But the fact of the matter is, whether the decisions that are made in places like Washington, D.C., or state houses, or even in county commission offices or municipal town hall buildings, are going to be the very things that either provide us with abundant ducks or scarce ducks, or the very things that are either going to provide us new hunting opportunities or restrict the ones we already have. And really, guys, when it comes to a problem, a habitat problem, the scale that we have, and you look how big the breeding grounds are, whether it's the eastern breeding grounds where you guys derive a goodly chunk of your ducks like mallards, or you're talking about the prairie pothole region, we're talking about huge landscapes. And there isn't enough money for on the planet for DU or Delta or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and even if we wanted to buy or protect that all with easement. So really, on the habitat side, it's going to be a public policy game, and we see it on the hunter side as well. I mean, you look at decisions that were made, Fish and Wildlife Service looking at the decline in lesser scaup and deciding to adopt a new scaup harvest strategy. Delta commissioned a panel of the best waterfowl population biologists and said, you're assuming that harvest is driving this, which based on the top population biologists in the country is a bunch of hooey, and you shouldn't do this. Or, that's a, sort of national Fish and Wildlife Service issue, but, there's lots of local issues. Hunters getting run out of access, especially in the Atlantic Flyway where there's lots of humanity, sort of bumping into each other. We worked very closely with our local chapters. We just a few weeks ago dealing with, there was a proposed, discharge law in New Jersey that worked with our chapters to turn back. There's untold numbers of stories of access where we worked with our volunteer and leadership in states all across the United States, areas all across the United States and Canada. Our goal is to really make sure, as you pointed out, that Delta has a voice in these public policy discussions, whether it's about habitat, whether it's about the federal farm bill, or whether it's about opportunity and access. We feel duck hunters need a consistent voice. And Sunday hunting is clearly one of those issues in the few blue law states in the Atlantic Flyway where they remain.
Yeah, when you talk about recruitment numbers and the number of waterfowl hunters dropping, in my neck of the woods, it's easy to see why. I mean, I hunt ducks in the shadows of the monuments of Washington, D.C., and we've got some downright great, duck hunting at times here, and it's tough to find a place to do it legally here. And, without paying a ton of money to be in a hunt club or, getting fortunate knowing a landowner or something like that, it can be very, very difficult to get access. And I can see why guys are, hesitant and turned off by it and, end up going, deer hunting or something like that, where, every little subdivision you find, will let you come in there and archery hunt for deer. So, it's a difficult circumstance that we're in here, but it's one that I feel is extremely valuable to a lot of people in the Atlantic Flyway, having a group organization like Delta focused on these issues in addition to, habitat and conservation, goals and things of that nature that are equally as important. But, like I said, having a voice for the hunters is certainly important. And I want to circle back to something you just mentioned. You talked about, preserving land and, through easements and those sorts of things and the money that it takes to do that kind of stuff on a large scale. It's a public policy, agenda. That money's coming from somewhere outside of just, membership and, duck stamps and that kind of stuff. One of the big fundings of that obviously is the farm bill, as you touched on. And, recently a new farm bill had been passed. And, I think unfortunately, given the economic climate that we find ourselves in, everybody probably expected to some degree to take a little bit of a haircut in there with that bill. But tell us a little bit more specifically about the farm bill, as far as what were some of the victories that, came out of that bill and what were some of the setbacks that came from it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty remarkable, but I think it really tells the story. In terms of, what has the disproportionate largest impact on land use and habitat, it's the federal farm bill. And I'd make the argument that it's the most important issue it's facing duck hunters and duck habitat. It certainly doesn't dismiss the need for increased investment via the federal duck stamp or the work that DU or others are doing to conserve habitat. But really, the federal farm bill is the 900-pound gorilla in terms of affecting land use and providing sort of the right policies and programs. So I guess the wins and losses, I'll start with losses. I don't know, just because that's kind of the day I had. But the CRP, which, as I told you earlier, really was, probably the most significant thing that's ever happened in North American breeding ducks. At its peak, the CRP program had, 39.2 million acres enrolled in it. And the challenge with CRP is that it is by far the single largest line item expense in FSA or NRCS's conservation portfolio. And when you're the biggest turkey in the grocery store, you're the one that's going to get cut the quickest in CRP. And I think we all knew this. This has been the trend over the last two farm bills. The last farm bill trimmed CRP down to 32 million acres, and then this current one took it all the way down to 24. So it's significantly decreased investment in CRP.
And John, just to clarify for those that may not be aware, CRP is basically the federal government funding these lands to remain unproductive in natural grassy habitats and things of that nature, correct?
Yeah, what it does is it basically pays a farmer to take his highly erodible cropland and put it into perennial cover, and which turns out to be wonderful places for ducks like mallards and shovelers and gadwall and blue-winged teal and scaup to nest in. And so, that's why it's important. But you're right. Too many acronyms. I'm a policy guy. I use too many of those. So if that was sort of a disappointment, it was not an unanticipated disappointment. I think we all sort of anticipated even 2 years ago that's about what it was going to be. I think the two bright spots were Congress continuing with what's referred to as a conservation compliance program, which basically says, if you're going to receive federal farm benefits through the Farm Service Agency, you have to maintain some baseline of conservation for wetlands and highly erodible soils. And believe it or not, what we were staring at in this current farm bill was the potential removal of protection for 70% of the most important wetlands in the U.S. prairie pothole region, hinging on that decision. And so that was a huge outcome. Retaining conservation compliance, which included swamp buster protection for those small wetlands for all federal farm programs, was a really important outcome. The other one, and any, folks have heard about the loss of native prairie in the Dakotas. There was a lot of pressure on this landscape, especially with commodity prices where they were, the Chinese importing growing numbers of soybeans, the renewable fuel standard, a variety of other sort of market forces were making, frankly, it was very attractive to break up any little bit of ground to press it into annual crop production. And a program that had failed at the 11th and a half hour in the conference committee in the last farm bill did pass this farm bill called Sod Saver. And what it does is it frankly just doesn't provide the financial incentive, be it taxpayer support for crop insurance, to break up native prairie and put it into production. So, those were the big outcomes, I think, for ducks. We certainly would have liked to have had more CRP, but we also understand the environment that we're in. But swamp buster and sod saver were very, very important and very positive outcomes.
Man, I'm not going to lie. It's difficult to think about the next question when you're throwing out all this good information of what the average reader doesn't always come across. So I think this is a very great conversation we're having here. But let's talk about the federal duck stamp, and it's increasing in price this year coming up. And where does that money go, and what programs does it end up in?
Well, I think it depends. And I've got a huge bias, right? I'm a breeding grounds guy. I grew up in Minnesota and around breed ducks, although not as many of them as my father and my grandfather grew up in Minnesota. But, and I lucky enough to live in North Dakota, which is smack dab in the heart of the most productive duck breeding habitat on the continent. And so I think when you look at the federal duck stamp, I think the federal duck stamp has a couple of objectives. One is to sort of conserve breeding habitat. There's sort of two primary mechanisms to do that. The lion's share of duck stamp money goes into two programs: a small wetland acquisition program, which is buying easements on small wetlands primarily in cropland, from willing private landowners. And that program alone has conserved in the U.S. prairies in North and South Dakota, 30% of the vulnerable wetlands. That's the legacy that duck hunters have with the duck stamp, is it's protected 30% of the vulnerable wetlands in North Dakota and South Dakota, which is a remarkable conservation achievement. Much less used these days than what it was in the past was the acquisition and, regular fee, simple interest, buying the land outright and putting it into WPAs. And those are properties that were purchased for the purposes of duck production, but, provide hunters a lot of hunting opportunity. And, I shoot ducks on WPAs here. I shoot pheasants on WPAs here. Guys shoot sharptails and white-tailed deer on WPAs. So, it provides a real key breeding habitat value, but it also provides recreational value. As you start moving down the flyways, the duck stamp is used primarily for the refuge program. And the nice thing about the duck stamp, and, I get it, most duck hunters aren't big fans of the government. Most folks aren't big fans of the government getting bigger. And I think it's hard for duck hunters to reconcile, but the federal duck stamp is the most cost-effective conservation program on the continent. Basically what the duck stamp did when it was founded all those many years ago was put into a fund for investment in conservation. Doesn't pay for staff, doesn't pay for maintenance, it pays for conservation. And so 98 cents of every dollar that duck hunters spend on that duck stamp goes straight into habitat conservation. And the prairies for making sure more duck production is produced, and on refuges, both for wintering water and staging waterfowl, but providing hunting opportunity. And then you need a group like Delta to make sure that folks are keeping their intended purpose to make sure there's public access on those refuges.
Yeah, I think one of our first episodes we talked about the duck stamp, and the 98 cents on your dollar that goes to the habitat and all of that. I mean, you just don't get those kind of programs. I mean, for $1.98, it's impressive.
Well, and the thing is, I think everybody, there's not a great deal of trust in our government. I don't know if there's ever been a great deal of trust in the government, but I think everybody says, well, Congress will steal that or somebody will take it over. But the fact of the matter is that is expressed in the law. That is one fund. Government's great at rating conservation funds. They've rated the Land and Water Conservation Fund for years, but they can't rate the Migratory Bird Fund. They cannot touch it. So those dollars always get back to their intended purposes.
So do you think the $10 per stamp increase, do you think we'll see more acreage, or what do you think that increase is for?
Oh, I think it's, the challenge is, if you just do a straight inflation correction from 1991, the dollar stayed static, the revenues from the duck stamp stayed static, and the cost of doing conservation has gone up immensely. I was here in 1991, but I was here in 1998, and you could buy all the cropland you wanted for $400 an acre in this part of North Dakota. Well, you can't touch that stuff today for under $1,000 an acre. So you've had 60% inflation and you've had land go from $400 to $1,000 an acre. At the same time, your buying power has been constrained at, in 1991 at $15. So yeah, absolutely. The cost of conservation is going up, and those revenues had to be, adjusted upward to provide the resources to maintain sort of the same conservation benefit outcome.
Yeah, that's a long time to not increase, and especially up there, with the Bakken going on, I'm sure that $1,000 an acre is even probably on a lower level there. But yeah. Anyway, you spoke to I think you mentioned the lesser scalp when talking about bag limit changes. Speak to the bag limit changes a little bit. The canvas back going from 2 to 1 and the scalp going from 3 to 2, and just kind of what's going on with those.
Well, the both species, the way duck harvest regulations are set is through the adaptive harvest management population model, and basically we set duck seasons based on, depends on where you are. If you're in the Atlantic Flyway, based on eastern breeding grounds mallard population estimates, and if you're in the Mississippi and Central Flyway, it's on the May Pond Count and traditional survey area. Now we have a new Western mallard model, which looks at California, British Columbia, some of the western boreal forests in Alaska. But, so that's how our general duck seasons are set. But, then you have the number of species. You've got black ducks, you've got pintails, you've got canvasback, and you've got lesser scaup that have sort of special regulations because, frankly, their populations aren't as strong as mallards. And the concern of the Fish and Wildlife Service is that they need more protection. A lot of this, guys, actually goes way back to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service being sued by the Humane Society of the United States over not having the data to support, liberalized hunting regulations for these species. And, as has become the case all too frequently, we see it with wolves about every 2.5 weeks. Lawsuits and injunctions are the kind of things that drag the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to a complete stop. And so the service has developed population models and harvest frameworks for all these species. And they're all a little different. The pintail one's different from the scaup one because ducks are frankly a little bit different. When it comes to canvasbacks, I grew up as a duck hunter. I started duck hunting when I was 12, and that was 1982. And so I came through the dark days of prairie drought, low duck populations, lowest population estimate ever for mallards. And frankly, as a kid, we had way more closed seasons than open seasons on canvasbacks and redheads in this part of the world. And so, really there's only been a couple of years in modern recorded history where we've been able to shoot 2 canvasbacks. I had some guys out here from Ohio last year, and we were on a really hot canvasback shoot. It was a beautiful traditional prairie canvasback shoot. I said, guys, you're each going to kill your 2 bull cans today as easy as you woke up this morning. But what I ask you to do is remember it forever because you may never see it again. It's been that rare. The canvasback harvest strategy is based on the observed population and their predicted production minus what they anticipate the harvest to be. And if that population the next year is anticipated to be about a certain threshold, they'll allow 2. But that's going to be a fairly rare occurrence, I think. When you get to lesser scaup, as I said earlier, the Fish and Wildlife Service felt like they had to do something with scaup, and nobody at the Fish and Wildlife Service believes that hunting is driving scaup populations, but they felt like they needed to do something. Well, we disagreed with them a little bit, but notwithstanding, they've adopted a new scaup harvest strategy. And that scaup harvest strategy is pretty simple. It's based on different thresholds for lesser scaup. That if scaup are above X, you get this harvest opportunity, and above Y, you get this. And so it's a fairly straightforward strategy. And at least it seems like scaup populations have been really sort of stable to increasing. So at least hopefully, we won't see scaup bag limits tighten up much more than they are today.
I wanted to ask you something about the canvasback when you were talking about that. Dan and I were up on the Maryland Eastern Shore here 2 or 3 weekends ago, and the first day that we hunted up there, it was just a massive push of canvasbacks into the area. I'm talking thousands of birds, and we would see flocks, 30 to 50 cans at a time, where you'd have a hard time picking a hen out of the entire flock, maybe 1, maybe 2. So we were talking about it, and I wanted to see if there was any validity to this kind of theory, but is part of the issue with the canvasback just the fact that there's a lot less hens for whatever reason than drakes, and is that what is part of what's holding the population growth back, or is it truly they were just so devastated by habitat, deteriorating and things of that nature, that it, just hasn't recovered, or whatever.
Yeah, I think, what you guys probably saw, and, it's pretty interesting. First of all, there's more drakes than hens at virtually every duck species. And the reason that is because drakes are smart enough not to lay eggs and sit in the grass and get eaten by raccoons or get eaten by foxes. So, I mean, in every duck species, survival of males is much higher than survival of females during the breeding season, which is when the lion's share of the mortality occurs, guys. So now what you probably saw is, the amazing thing about migration is you take a species like canvasbacks, after the females are sort of really hard into nesting, and at the end of the sort of peak of the nesting season, all the drakes gather up and they fly north and they molt together. There won't be many females in those bunches. They go off and molt and they sort of migrate together. And we see this with canvasbacks, we see it with redheads. We've got a wintering population of mallards here in North Dakota, and there's Susies in those bunches, but, it's less than 10% of the flock. And so you can see those things when you're hunting and go, what's going on here? But, really the canvasback story is couple-fold. The perfect breeding marsh for canvasbacks are little itty-bitty semi-permanent wetlands, primarily in prairie Canada. I mean, we raise a fair few in North Dakota and South Dakota. Used to raise a bunch in northwestern Minnesota, but it's really Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta is ground zero for canvasback production. And prairie Canada is still losing wetlands at the same rate today, guys, that they were in 1970s, despite the $1 billion wetland conservation investment that's been made up there. Wetland loss rate's the same. So with canvasbacks, it's really about ponds, and then it's also really about raccoons. Raccoons moved into the Canadian prairies in the 50s, and raccoons are one critter that will go out and forage in flooded vegetation where canvasbacks nest. And boy, I tell you, canvasback nests are pretty exposed, and a raccoon that goes out and does a little effort can eat a lot of canvasback eggs. And then you get redhead parasitism's a pretty limiting factor for canvasbacks too. So, but it's really the story with canvasback is breeding habitat loss and certainly the degradation of places like the Susquehanna Flats and other sort of key wintering areas on the Atlantic Fly.
Yeah, it's just amazing to see because, we see these just massive amounts of birds, and it's just, it's just counterintuitive to see that kind of flight and just be like, man, it's just, it seems like there's something more to this, why the numbers haven't been higher and better. It wasn't that long ago, the moratorium on Canada geese was on up at the Maryland Eastern Shore, and, we were up there, and it's just, flight after flight all day long. And just to see those numbers, it's, it's crazy to think that it wasn't that long ago that, you weren't even allowed to take one. And, now we're up to, you can take two up there. But, it's remarkable stuff when you think about, how quickly things can swing and change and how, bag limits and things are, put in place to help kind of manage that. But, I wanted to move on to another topic that we hear a lot about, and I'm sure you've heard this a bunch too. And, there's a lot of sentiment out there amongst people that the migration is becoming later and later in the year. So you hear a lot of, well, yeah, we get, Dan says this all the time. He says, yeah, we get cans and redheads and all kinds of stuff down here, but, it's after the season's closed. So a lot of guys say, well, I want to move my season back so we have a chance to actually hunt the ducks while they're here. Is there actually any hard evidence to bear out the fact that, the migration and maybe pushing back later into the year? And would you be in favor of kind of moving the season back, if that were to be true?
Yeah, well, I'll give you, you kind of give me a part one and a part two, so I'll try to do them in order. But is the migration later? Now, I think there are a lot of duck hunters that feel that way. The problem is we have no means to determine it. And we were commissioned, 4 or 5 years ago to do a study to answer that question. And we looked at every available data set and said, what can you use? And I guess you could use midwinter data, but, midwinter survey data is been collected a lot of different ways going back to the 60s. And, It's pretty variable. The state surveys are, frankly, everybody's changed them 1,000,001 different times, so you can't really assess the change over time. And so what we decided was, what's one data set that is the same since 1961? And what we used was the wing bee survey. So you guys are familiar with the Fish and Wildlife Service parts collection survey, where duck hunters shoot a duck and clip the wing off and say when they shot it, send it into the feds. And that data is really important for understanding what the harvest is, what the harvest composition is, what the sex ratio in the harvest is, and what the age ratio is, the number of juvenile to young in the harvest is. And that's pretty fundamental information for managing duck harvest and duck populations. And so what we did is we got all that data from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service going all the way back to 1961. Guys, this is the kind of thing that will grind a supercomputer down to its nubs, because there's just millions and millions of data points. And so what we did is we looked at a whole sort of range of species. So everybody wants to talk about mallards, and okay, well, we should talk about mallards, but we also know that mallards aren't the duck. They're a duck, and they're a very important duck. But we also know that mallards have some different tendencies. Mallards will field feed. A lot of other ducks don't field feed. So what we did is we took mallards, and we took pintails, and we took teal, and we took ringnecks, and we sort of said, okay, what's the trend? And what we looked is to see a change in the mean date of harvest for all those species across all 4 flyways and across all 50 states. And when I'm telling you it grinds a supercomputer to a halt, it does. We're talking millions of data points. And what we found is, from 1961 to, I think, the last year of evaluation was about 2012, harvest has certainly gotten later. Now, what we decided is we can't say when ducks migrate, but we made the safe assumption. I think you guys would agree with this, and I'm a duck hunter and not a research scientist. But, if a duck is in the state of Virginia in January, and if a duck is shot in Virginia in January, it probably means he migrated there, right? That's a pretty safe assumption.
Yep.
So we use harvest as a surrogate for migration, which isn't perfect, but it's the best we could do with the data we had. Now, here's the fascinating thing. Across many, many, many areas, harvest for a lot of these species was later. But the interesting thing was, and I remember our current president, who was our scientific director at the time, Dr. Frank Bohr, called me and says, "You aren't going to believe this data." He says, "We're shooting ducks a lot later." And I said, "Well, yeah, we're shooting ducks a lot later." I said, "You got to do an overlay with the seasons." And so when you correct for seasons, so a duck theoretically, or at least supposed to only get shot when the season's open. And so what happened is we were certainly shooting ducks later most places, but we were hunting ducks much later most places. So if there's an imperfection in our study, we can't correct for what's happening outside of when a duck dies and his wing gets clipped off and sent to the service. But what we found is that, the relationship, there's a very tight correlation in most places between when a state had seasons and when the ducks got shot. And what we found is ducks are certainly being harvested later, but they're certainly being hunted later. So we can't quite tease out the variables. So the second question is, should we be shooting ducks much later? Well, you guys, I don't know how old you guys are, but it wasn't too very long ago when duck seasons used to close before January 20th. The only reason duck seasons end at the Sunday closest to January 31st or open earlier here in my neck of the woods is because Trent Lott, who is a ranking U.S. Senator from Mississippi, held up the confirmation of a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service director to get later duck seasons. And that was pretty contentious. Delta had actually done some research. It was captive research, so it doesn't perfectly emulate what happens in the wild, and showed that when you start pulling a female mallard or pulling a drake mallard from a female mallard, the later you go, there's some signal. It's not remarkably profound, but there was some signal that her reproductive success decreased, which is sort of why we always, shut seasons down a little earlier. So, that certainly hasn't, we've been shooting ducks to the end of January across all 4 flyways for a long time, and it certainly hasn't collapsed North American mallard populations any. So we're probably okay. I don't think there's going to be much sort of willingness to start shooting later than that. I remember being at the North American Duck Symposium a couple of years ago in Memphis. It's the biggest collection of waterfowl researchers and managers on the continent. And I was talking to guys that were shooting wood ducks that, they weren't shooting them exactly going in and out of wood duck boxes, but they were seeing, follicle development, that those females were getting ready to lay eggs.
Yeah.
You talk to the guys in California. California is an interesting place. California has lots of breeding mallards, but their mallards have a remarkably long breeding season. And I was on the phone with guys out in California today, and they said if this mild weather keeps up the way they've had, they're not going to be surprised if they see mallards nesting here any day now. So, it's one of those things that I think you start pushing it too much, you may start to have you might start doing damage. And the reality of it is we all see a lot more ducks or a lot more pheasants or a lot more deer a week after the hunting season because the super black eagles have gone away. The war eagles are at the dock or on the trailer, and the ducks get a chance to settle down, and they're more visible, and they're places where they haven't been because they haven't been being chased and shot at and all the rest of those things. And so yeah, I don't know. I'd be hard pressed to come out in favor of shooting ducks much later than we currently are.
Now I did want to touch just real quick, Josh. Now you guys definitely have more data than what I do of driving to my duck hunting spots. So, I mean, your research is definitely above mine, but we do end up, we have a little split around Christmas, but then we come back in here, like December 27th through January 1st, and that's the end of our season. So usually we do get a good push of ducks all through January, but yeah, we end January 1 in our duck season here.
I think the key then is, I think the key point there is, states are given lots of flexibility to do zones and splits. That's pressing your state agency to provide you the full opportunity under the federal framework, which, Delta would, very aggressively advocated on behalf of the states to provide sort of maximum flexibility within the federal framework to increase the numbers of zones and splits states could offer to their hunters, because you're right. If the zone doesn't suit you very well, but that's a state issue more than a Fed issue, because, theoretically you could be shooting those ducks to the end of January.
Yeah, and that's Pennsylvania. So we did get a huge cold snap, the polar vortex early in the season. So this was one of the first years I remember where we just had, hundreds of redheads and canvasbacks mixed in actually during the season. But then, that was very short lived that they were here. But on average, when the birds are here, yeah, our guns are put away, like you were mentioning, but it's definitely not the end of January.
Right. So
yeah, and here in Virginia, we can hunt ducks until this year. They went out on the 25th, I think, of January. And yep. There's a couple things that I think about when I hear guys talking about the season and moving it around and stuff. The best hunting that I had this year in the state of Virginia was in mid to mid-late November. It got cold.
Yeah, when the first big cold front came through.
Yep, and we had tons of ducks, tons of geese. I shot my first canvasback ever on November 22nd. That's unheard of for this area to have them down that early. And, I saw a bunch of ducks, and then, our season goes out, for the first 2 weeks of December. And then the third split, through Christmas and into January was just very, very slow. We kept getting colder and colder weather, and we just kept waiting, and I never saw the ducks. And then the last week of the season, week and a half of the season, we got a nice push and we had a bunch of redheads, and I was able to scratch out, finally a limit of bluebills and stuff like that. But, it was just really interesting to see how the season kind of broke out and how good the season was early. And that kind of gets me to my point that I wonder how harvest data and, hunter opinion and stuff is impacted by the fact that mid-November in this area is rut time. Guys are in deer stands, they're chasing bucks, that kind of stuff. I wonder how much of those guys miss these good flights of ducks because they're in the deer stand that time of year, and then they hang up the bow and they head to the duck blind, the beginning of that third split in December, and we didn't have ducks again until, last 2 weeks. So they're the ones that are saying, I think we need to move the season back. We're not seeing any ducks until the last week of the season. That's when we can finally shoot them, type of thing. So I wonder if that's a common thing around, around the area, or if that's just something, crazy that I've thought up in my head.
I mean, that's a character deficiency. Anybody who's willing to rot in a deer stand and not chase ducks with the ducks are on a character deficiency. But I'll be honest, guys. This is, our deer season always coincides with our big freeze up flight. Always does. And so I'm torn. I like shooting alfalfa munchers with a rifle as much as the next guy. I like eating them. But this year I didn't even think about deer hunting until, the ducks were gone. I'm pretty non-typical in North Dakota, where the entire state goes deer hunting, and it's great for me because there's only a few of us guys silly enough to be out there chasing around and trying to shoot mallards and snow geese at that time of the year. But I think there's a lot of talk. There's talk in New Jersey about what they should do with their zones and splits, and so there's some sort of managers that like to have duck season closed during deer season, because that takes more pressure off, some of these resources, and guys want to have the opportunity to deer hunt and want opportunity to duck hunt. I think it's one of those things where, I think it's really important, whether you're the Fish and Wildlife Service or a state agency, that, you're collecting good, sound information from your hunter constituents to make those decisions. I think that's the best we can hope for.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. And, it's going to always probably be one of those topics that, you're never going to get the entire, group of folks involved to agree on one particular thing. But, as long as the data that's collected is being sound, I think, the best possible decision can be made. And you talk about deer hunting here in Virginia. We can hunt deer with a bow until like the end of April, I think, in the local jurisdictions where I'm at here. So I literally don't think about deer hunting until, the birds are long gone and, hopefully some snow's melted off and I'm warming up for turkey season. So I'll take the bow out a couple of times, but a little bit of a unique situation here. But anyway, I wanted to talk about something. You just mentioned snow geese, and snow geese are a really just kind of a fascinating thing, how this has all taken place. And, obviously, they're a problem to some degree with the conservation seasons that we've, seen put into place. It's crazy to think that you can hunt, waterfowl with unplugged shotguns, unlimited bird harvests, electronic collars, the whole nine. So let's talk a little bit about the snow geese population, how much damage they cause. Have the conservation seasons made a positive impact and reached harvest goals that they were hoping to do, and just sort of the state of the union on the snow geese issue?
Yeah, well, first of all, I haven't heard, and I was mentioning this to a friend of mine here last week, is I haven't heard tickety-boo about the degradation of snow geese since about the late 1990s. And so, here's what we know about snow geese is the Fish and Wildlife Service will tell we've got a whole pile of snow geese. And then there are a bunch of snow goose researchers that are the best in the business who will tell you we have about 5 times more than the Fish and Wildlife Service tells you we have based on their modeling. And so whoever's number you believe, there's a lot of snow geese. Now, but I am not hearing, there were these doomsday predictions coming out in the mid-90s and late 90s that really catalyzed the conservation order. And that, these animals were going to degrade their habitat. They were going to eat themselves out of house and home. It wasn't only going to be bad for snow geese, but it was going to be bad for all the resident flora and fauna on the tundra. Although I tell you guys, I've been lucky enough. I made a trip of a lifetime a number of years ago to Hudson's Bay. There ain't much there to destroy, but so I think, so you asked the question, so are they still doing damage? I'm not hearing about it. And, I'm in the game, and I'd be hearing about it if there was a catastrophe looming. And what seems to be happening is these snow geese are sort of colonizing new areas, and they're spreading out. Now, does that have consequences, 50 or 100 years down the line that I'm not smart enough to anticipate? It might. But at least I'm not hearing the stories of catastrophe that we were hearing in the mid to late 90s. The second question is conservation order helping? And I think if you ask the population biologists, we are probably not impacting snow goose survival very drastically. I mean, if you look at, these smart statistical guys, and I'm lucky enough to know a few of these guys. I mean, the math of these guys too is pretty mind-boggling, but they use a Lincoln estimator and show the increase. The increase looks to me to be pretty unchecked. The one sort of major influencer on snow goose populations different than prairie ducks. Prairie ducks is all about water on the prairies. With snow geese in most Arctic nesting geese, and guys, this is what hurts your Atlantic goose population so badly is, bad winters and late thaws. It's such a short breeding season that if it gets delayed, you have very drastically reduced production. And so that's the thing that seems to be the only thing that sort of is putting a governor on lesser snow goose populations. But I've got to imagine, I mean, we got a lot of guys out there, and it's become more than a cottage industry. It's a pretty big industry around snow goose hunting, and we've got to be treated. I don't know if we're still, if we're just taking the whipped cream off the top of the hot chocolate, or if we're actually sipping some hot chocolate out of that population. But I tell you, it's become one of those things that's sort of one of my, and I'm, frankly, I'm not much of a goose hunter. I do way more goose hunting in the spring than I do during the fall, and it's turned into one of my most memorable hunts of the year. The few times that I get to go each spring.
Well, we definitely talk about going, and when we go down to the Eastern Shore, and even this year, we had a knot of about 5,000 coming at us. Our guide saying, well, there's about 25,000 over there, and 5,000 are coming at us, and it's just something that Josh and I definitely need to get on for sure. That's always fun to see. But let's talk about just the impact that hunting has. What you see, piles of snow geese, piles of Canadas, piles of ducks all over Facebook, all over everything. How much does hunting actually have an effect on waterfowl population?
Well, it is a bad answer, but I'll start with it and I'll make it better as we go along. It's really very low, guys. And if you looked at, let's take mid-continent mallards as an example. Research that was done by a really smart statistician took a huge amount of data that Ducks Unlimited had collected on research that they were doing in Prairie Canada. And he determined that he was trying to figure out what vital rates impacted mid-continent mallards the most. And what he determined with his first analysis is that winter mortality, which is hunting and natural mortality, only accounted for about 9% of the change. When he did the second batch of his analysis, it was a little higher, it's about 16%. And that's consistent with what we've seen in mid-continent with Great Lakes mallards. It's pretty consistent with what we've seen in western mallards. If you look at the harvest rate, pretty consistent harvest rate in this part of the world on adult drake mallards, it's about 12%. We're shooting about 12% of the population based on band reporting.
No, I was just going to say a lot, you hear people say all the time, oh, hunters don't even put a dent in it. But, I mean, if you're talking between 9 and 16%, that's a decent chunk. So
it's a decent chunk. It's a decent chunk until you figure out that red fox kill 900,000 adult ducks on the breeding season every spring, or used to. It's a lot until you figure out that, Old Wives Lake will have a botulism outbreak and kill 20,000 ducks in a week. The other thing about it is, we don't see every duck that dies of natural causes. So, I mean, it's a chunk, absolutely. But the real factor is is how a population, there's this debate between is harvest additive or compensatory. And the real answer to that is it's both. And what additive mortality means is additional to the sort of natural, is hunting mortality additional to the natural mortality. And compensatory means that hunting mortality is just compensating for natural mortality. And what happens is harvest is neither additive or compensatory. It's both, because, that the additivity or compensation is related to what that duck's population and reproductive potential is. We know harvest is very additive on species like Canada geese, on species like snow geese, on Arctic nesting geese that don't breed until they're a few years old. Harvest is certainly more additive on canvasbacks than it is on blue-winged teal. But in the grand scheme of things, it's one of those things we should keep our eyes on. But when you've got really strong populations and good production, with most of our duck species, it's probably nothing to be too overly concerned about. And that's coming from a guy that is an absolute Drake Nazi, that, is very selective about his harvest. And, I've always been a guy that's always probably been overly concerned about the role harvest plays in duck populations, from being a duck depression kid of the 80s and early 90s. What I've seen, and we're shooting a mountain of ducks right now, and we have been since the 90s, very liberal seasons, very high bag limits. But we've had really good population size, and we've had really good production. The concern is when habitat conditions deteriorate and reproductive success falls, that paradigm will certainly shift a little bit.
And before you move on, I want to ask one question here. So I've thought about this a couple times, and again, this could be me being crazy, but let me ask you, and you tell me if there's any validity to this. I live in an area where a lot of subdivisions and this, that, and the other golf courses where, you get resident geese on these ponds, and I swear their life consists of floating around in the water, jumping up out of there, taking a crap in the bunker, and then eating some grass around the green and jumping back in the water. So I drive by these ponds every single day, and I see these geese in there, but I never see any that have just passed away from natural causes or anything like that. You never see them just like one just floating out there that's passed away for whatever reason. So do they go somewhere to do that? Like, can they sense it, or is it?
No, they just don't die. They just don't die.
They just live for like 30 years if no one messes with them.
Yeah, some bad will eventually happen to them. It's just not in the golf course pond.
Yeah, it's crazy because I was spring turkey hunting one time, to digress here really quickly, and it was just across the street from a golf course, and there was a little feeder creek that went into this pond, and I sat there on the bank and I watched this creek for probably 45 minutes, and there was a one lone honker laying in there with his head down on the water, and I thought he was dead, and I said, that's what happens. They go up in these little backwaters or something, and they just sort of, put themselves out to pasture or whatever. And then out of nowhere, 45 minutes of zero movement from this bird, he gets up and flies away. I was floored. I literally didn't know what to make of it. I mean, he had wood ducks swimming alongside him and never moved. It was insane. Yeah. I don't even know. I don't know what to make of it, but. All right, there's part one of our interview with John Devney of Delta Waterfowl, and I tell you, we covered a bunch right there in that first part, and not only does he know his stuff, but it's pretty clear that Delta Waterfowl has a profound impact on not only duck recruitment but hunters and legislation and things of that nature. And I learned a lot from that discussion. What about you, Dan? What did you take away?
Well, that's what I think I even mentioned. Like, it was difficult to go on to my next question because I was so intrigued with what he was saying. He definitely definitely has the information, which, he said he enjoys getting questions and, can come off the cuff with all the answers. So, I mean, he's, like he said, he's in the game and he knows what's going on. So I'm glad that we can bring stuff like this to our listeners and have a guest like John on our show.
Yeah, I agree with you. So next week we'll have part 2 of the interview with John, quite a bit shorter, but we're going to get into some habitat managed techniques. And, if you're a guy that owns a little chunk of property, or you have a club or a lease that's got a small pond or something that maybe holds a few ducks, or maybe you'd like it to hold some ducks, we talk about ways that you can improve that habitat, talk about some water management, and, just some conservation things that you can do as the spring approaches. And we kind of get into, that phase of the year, providing, breeding habitat so much. So, check that out next week when we get into the other half of that. And, anything else from you, Daniel, that you would like to, cover this week before we get into the end of the show?
I don't think so. I think I'm pretty caught up here.
Okay. Well, a couple things, though, just to close out the show. We want to make sure that we thank the partners that have helped, in part produce this show. Sitka Gear, Sport Ear, Higdon Outdoors, Big Al's Silhouette Decoys, Bison Coolers, and Backwoods Decoy Systems. If you guys are in the market for any kind of, gear and looking for these types of products, please consider them if you're making a purchase. And again, feel free to use the HP Outdoors discount code with Bison Coolers if you're looking to pick up a cooler. So thank you to all of them and their support of this show. All right. I think that's going to do it. I'm going to go ahead and we'll get into this week's parting shot and wrap up the show. So this week's parting shot is about the movie American Sniper. And this segment of the show is not scripted. I don't write anything out for this. I don't prepare for this. It's just kind of whatever comes to mind. And as I sat in the theater and I watched this movie, it reinforces the sacrifice that the soldiers of this country make. Chris Kyle sacrificed a good portion of his life, 4 combat deployments to the worst places in the world. It's a shame that there's people out there that want to throw, kick dirt on his grave and disrespect the heroism that he showed to this country. I don't even know if that's a freaking word, but regardless, Chris Kyle's an American hero that should be honored. And I'm glad to see that the state of Texas made Chris Kyle Day and is paying him the proper respects that he should. It's good that the movie is out there, but the unfortunate part is there's a lot of Chris Kyles out there that'll never get the thank you and the respect that they deserve. So please, we've said this a million times on this show, and I'll say it a million more times if I have to. Thank a veteran, thank a current service member, give them a hug, give them a handshake, buy them a lunch. I assure you they deserve it, and we'll never be able to fully repay the debt that we owe them. That's going to wrap up episode 24 of the HP Outdoors Waterfowl podcast. We appreciate you guys tuning in this week, and we would encourage you to check us out at hpoutdoors.com and also on iTunes. You can find all of our past episodes and get caught up on everything that we have been doing here at HP Outdoors. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We recently put out a video from our trip up to the Eastern Shore. Make sure you give that a look. And if you got any questions or concerns for us, you can reach us at 724-609-FOWL, the HP Outdoors Waterfowl hotline. If you haven't had a chance yet, sign up for our newsletter and get the great content from us through that. Till next time, for Dan, I'm Josh. Take care.